Hi, everyone. It's Pastor Dave here. I'm here to try to convince you why I should be your online pastor. I have the education and a solid Christian value perspective that you may or may not have thought about, especially if you're a social, fiscal, conservative Christian. You may embrace this kind of thinking to help you live your life more consistent with Christian values, as we all should, because that's really where we can generate the power of Christ in our life and even in our country or in the world. So I encourage you to try to follow along. I am a pastor, well, by virtue of education, but not in the pastoral formal sense. I have gotten my pastor certification through an online Christian ministry. $32 got me the actual certificate, but I do have some education in the area. So I just want to kind of get to it. Some of the things that we want you to think about are the Christian values that should be guiding our life. So I'm hoping that through this process, you can sort of reaffirm your desire to live Christian values in your everyday living, not just in your hopeful afterlife living. We don't want you to just put only emphasis on the divinity of Christ, his death representing the saving of you and your soul for purposes of eternal salvation. That's not what this is about. This is to more directly get you involved in your own life and live more Christian value-based living. And these Christian values of non-judgment, forgiveness, love, and peace are all higher consciousness level values. They're not just sort of basic level. Learning how to not judge yourself and others is a very important skill in helping you develop spiritually, or helping you develop whatever relationship you want to have with Christ, however figuratively or literally you want to take that. Same with forgiveness, but forgiveness I consider a higher level of consciousness. So in the way I envision Christ teaching us, he wanted you to start at the non-judgment level. And in order to get to the forgiveness level, you have to be proficient or good at being non-judgmental to yourself. How can you forgive yourself if you cannot stop judging yourself? So that's why those are in the steps that they're in. So, and the same is going to be true for not judging others. In the same idea, can you forgive others if you can't stop judging others? My answer is no, you can't. So that's why you have to provide these in order: non-judgment first, then forgiveness. And the same thing for love. You can't really move on to the love step, because if you can't forgive yourself for your shortcomings and you can't forgive others, you can never learn to love yourself and love others. So that's, again, why they're in this sort of progressive step form. And this is how Christ wanted you to learn. He wanted you to learn each of these steps so you can get to the next higher level of consciousness. And the same is true. You can't love yourself and love others if you don't forgive yourself, and forgive others if you don't stop judging yourself and judging others. And the same for peace. You want to achieve the highest level of consciousness. You achieve this inner peace by going through the steps of non-judgment, forgiveness, and love. So until then, you can't really achieve an inner peace for yourself and for the world. So it's imperative that you try to apply these Christian values to your daily living to help you gain perspective that you probably don't have if you don't have these values. So that's why I encourage you to try to come to an understanding. And that's my job. As your pastor online, I'm going to try to help you understand what these values are and how they should be applied. I know a lot of Christians, social conservative Christians, will give lip service to these concepts, but they don't necessarily live their life rooted in these values. In fact, I feel that they actually prefer the Old Testament values as the guiding values for their daily living. So Old Testament values are distinctly different than New Testament Christian values of non-judgment, forgiveness, love, and peace. In the Old Testament, obedience is the number one value, meaning you follow the commandments, any laws of God. Those are that's your first value priority. You are to live a life avoiding sin and any other abominations, however that is to be applied. And in so doing, if others are not doing the same thing, this is where you are encouraged to condemn others, to keep them in line. And you're also encouraged to allow for punishment of others who do not follow the rules, who are not obedient, so that you end up living in fear of God and in fear of others. Because if others are not following God's law, then you have reason to be afraid of them. And so that's the value system constructed in the Old Testament. The whole idea, the Hebrews, the original tribe that embraced this whole idea of the Old Testament, of course, they called it the Torah. I mean, the 5 books, the Pentateuch, that lay out all the rules of living and all the things that have to happen for you to live your life. And if you don't live that life according to these 5 books, then you should be punished. And God, there are plenty of stories throughout the entire Old Testament which shows just how powerful God is, how vengeful God is, how jealous God is. And although you shouldn't necessarily admire these qualities, Old Testament social conservative Christians do. They think that is the way they should relate to God, which, in my opinion, is away from Christian thinking. Christ did not want us to live in fear, did not want us to live in fear of others. He wanted us to develop love and peace. Those are the ultimate goals that we should be living by. And those are harder goals. I understand people's attraction to Old Testament values. After all, this reflects exactly who we are as human beings. We don't know ourselves well enough to know what we should do, so we need to follow rules. And if we're obedient to those rules, we won't be punished. So living in fear keeps us living properly. But it is a fear-based lifestyle. It's not love-based. It's not peace, which is what Christ wanted. This is all fear-based. This is condemnation, punishment. That's what the Old Testament tried to instill in the original Hebrew tribe. As they're developing this religion, they wanted to keep the people from doing things like polytheistic animal worshiping. So they made all these rules about that. And if you broke those rules, you were punished. And that's how you kept in line. Christ had a broader vision, a much more uplifting vision. Says, yeah, you have to follow the rules. I get that. But we can be more than just what the Old Testament shows we are. And for that, I agree. And this is where Christ's values system is far more spiritually uplifting than anything the Old Testament can offer. You know, it's one thing to follow the rules and live your life in that I consider oppression, but it's another thing entirely to approach your life from non-judgment forgiveness so that you can achieve things like world love, inner love of yourself, and inner peace and love for everyone else, and so that we can all live in peace together. That's far more broader vision than what the Old Testament brings. And Christ only told us that we should follow the rules because it is important that we follow the rules, but we don't want to live in the oppression of rules. And we certainly don't want to live in the fear of if you don't live in the rules, you'll get severely punished. That's why Christ offered forgiveness. He knows we're flawed. He understood this is our Old Testament image is who we are, but that we should learn to forgive so that we can raise ourselves up beyond our Old Testament values. So that's the nature of the distinction between Christian values and Old Testament values. And it's also the distinction between social, fiscal, conservative Christians and more progressive minded Christians. Social conservative, fiscal conservative Christians are rooted in Old Testament thinking. That's what guides their political choices. And these are the oppressive approaches to political policy and understanding. Whereas progressive minded Christians who embrace non-judgment and forgiveness and love are going to easily embrace a more progressive, more Christian value-based approach to their politics. And I just want to show you how this would work. So here we have the distinction between Christian values and Old Testament values. And we're just going to try to apply these values to various political positions. Certainly, this is not a complete list, but I just want to show you that distinction. And abortion is probably the most distinctive one, that when you approach it from an Old Testament value, it's going to be it'll look far different than if you approach it from a new Christian value-based perspective. So abortion, ending the life of an unborn baby, is the issue. And of course, the approach is unique. Pro-life, I reserve for those Christians that live their life in Christian values. Anti-abortion is the term that is used or should be used to identify social conservative, fiscal conservative Christians who live by the Old Testament values. Pro-life, New Testament, anti-abortion, Old Testament. Understand the distinction? It's important that we make that distinction. Anti-abortion is just a rule. God said we should not kill others. Therefore, you apply this rule to everyone, including an unborn baby. There's no compassion. There's no forgiveness. There's no broader, non-judgmental perspective to try to instill love. This is the rule. Even though there's really no clear Old Testament rule that identifies abortion as wrong, and it's not that specific, although there is a strange passage in Numbers 5, 11 through 31, where they describe this odd ritual where a husband suspects the wife has been unfaithful. So the husband goes to the priest. And so the priest goes through this little ritual, which the potentially unfaithful wife has to go through along with the priest. She has to end up drinking this dirty water. And in so doing, and certain things are said and prayers are made so that God can now intervene and make a decision. And if the God decides to abort the baby, that is proof positive that the woman was unfaithful to her husband. And of course, Old Testament law subsequently says, okay, if the woman aborts the baby, then the woman has to be put to death because being unfaithful is also an act of Old Testament rule breaking and therefore worthy of some kind of punishment. So you see that abortion has all of this kind of heavy implication of being much more about condemnation, punishment, than a pro-lifer position, which is more about forgiveness and compassion, love, that kind of thing. So again, anti-abortion, you don't want to commit the act of killing an unborn baby, but if God does it, it's okay under that circumstance because those are the laws of God. And so you see that perspective is dictated by Old Testament values. So therein lies the difference. Old Testament says anti-abortion is just in general bad because you're killing something. But as far as specifically being anti-abortion, it doesn't appear God really condemns it because he can do it readily if he wants to. So that's considered, I guess, the natural abortion. So when God does it, it's okay. And then if we were to decide on our own to do it, it's not okay. So that's the Old Testament anti-abortionist perspective. A pro-lifer would do it a little differently. They would see the mother as a person, and they would understand her difficulties. She's bringing a child into this world, and she may not have the means to do that. She may have been raped. Other horrible things may have happened. And the pro-lifer would have compassion. And the pro-lifer would encourage her to keep the child and try to help the mother and the child continue their life together so that the mother is able to truly take care of the child. They don't have to live in abject poverty and suffering. But the anti-abortionist has no qualms about forcing the woman to keep the child until now that the law says it's illegal for her to kill her baby. And then the mother has the baby and is forced to struggle and suffer and try to keep her baby alive. And it's like there's such a lack of compassion from the anti-abortionist perspective. And that's because it's based on Old Testament values of fear and condemnation, whereas a pro-lifer is based on New Testament thinking, where we try to be compassionate. Now, of course, the anti-abortionist is, well, how can you be pro-lifer and still allow abortions? It's not that we want to allow abortions, but a pro-life, meaning a woman who chooses the baby's life, her baby's unborn life, does so in a pro-choice environment because it's real choice. In an anti-abortionist environment, the woman doesn't have a choice, or else she will be put to death or at least jailed. I have no idea what the law would look like if the social conservatives have their way and make the law of the land an anti-abortionist stance. They try to show some compassion and suggest that they would not kill the mother or even punish her, but they would punish the doctors. That is unclear, and it's not consistent with their Old Testament values. Their Old Testament values would say, absolutely, if a mother chooses to kill her baby, she's going to get punished. So that's the real Old Testament. The fact that they're trying to infuse some of this New Testament concept of compassion is disingenuous. It's fake. It's not a real thing. Social conservative Christians would absolutely promote a condemnation and punishment alley for the woman who goes against the law and breaks the law to kill her unborn child. It's not that they have real love for the unborn child. They just would rather say, you live your life according to the law. God says you should not do that, then you will be punished. And that's what an Old Testament value-based Christian would think. So they don't really think about the compassion, the love of the child, the potential for the child to live a good life outside of poverty, outside of poor health. So they would never politically choose something that would be beneficial to the child, unborn child, and the mother carrying that child. So they wouldn't have some kind of medical program or education training program where you can help the mother take care of her child in a viable way, instead of just making her have the child and then she has to fend for herself. Anti-abortionists, you fend for yourself. You don't kill your child, you fend for yourself. We do not care what happens to mother and child once the child's born. That is clear. They do not have that level of compassion. They can't possibly have the level of compassion because their Old Testament values have no compassion. It's all about fear, condemnation, and punishment. Those are the only guiding forces in the Old Testament Christian mind. Whereas if you try to embrace New Testament Christian values of non-judgment, forgiveness, love, compassion, and peace, your whole political perspective changes considerably. So being pro-life in a pro-choice environment makes the best sense for a Christian value-based person or Christian, because you are truly pro-life. You are truly in favor of helping both mother and child to do the most they can to try to create a world where compassion is the governing principle, where we can really help each other out. But no such thing from an anti-abortionist Old Testament perspective. It's about the law. You obey the law or you get punished. And Christians who say that that's somehow compassionate are lying to themselves, because that's not compassion. That's just forcing people to follow law and governing by fear. That's what an Old Testament social conservative Christian is doing. They're relying on Old Testament mentality to dictate their politics. And that's why it's distinct from New Testament thinkers who are pro-lifers. So pro-lifers, New Testament, anti-abortionists, Old Testament. And you can use this kind of thinking for any political issue, and you will reveal the inner motivation of an Old Testament Christian versus a New Testament Christian, a real Christian value-based. It's going to produce a different perspective politically than an Old Testament Christian's perspective. For example, gun control. It should be clear as a Christian that Christ would never have wanted you to even own a gun. So as a Christian, I don't even understand why you own a gun, because it is a weapon and it is potentially used for violence. But I do understand it enough to know that if you're an Old Testament Christian, you live on a principle of fear. And having a gun is because you live in a world where you fear everyone. You fear the God you follow and everyone else. You live in fear. Fear is your guiding principle, so that's why you have to have guns, and that's why you don't want gun control. Because gun control means the government is interfering with your right to have a gun, which means if you don't have your right to have a gun, you can't protect yourself, you can't stop people from harming you. And so there you are living in your life in fear. A Christian, value-based Christian, a New Testament thinking Christian, doesn't live their life in fear. So they would not own a gun. Even for sport, it wouldn't make sense, but maybe they do for sport. But the idea is that we should have some kind of gun control so that people are not violent. We know the world is violent. Believe me, Old Testament thinking, it nails it. They understand human beings' nature. But New Testament Christians want us to rise above that nature. And that's where the distinction politically is drawn. If Old Testament Christians really want to live in fear and they don't see the uplifting value of New Christian value-based thinking, then that's sad, because to me, that means you're not really a Christian. And if the only reason why you define yourself as a Christian is because what Christ can do for you in the afterlife, that eternal salvation. So that's wherein lies the problem. Old Testament lives in the future. They live in the afterlife. New Testament, they live now, here and now, and they want to make the world a better place. Progressives want to make the world a better place. So they are more in line with Christian values than the social conservative idea of politics, where you don't. You want a world of punishment, condemnation, and fear. That's the world you want. So I don't consider you a Christian, but I understand that you can proclaim Christ as your Savior and you secure your, punch your ticket to ride in eternal salvation. I get the reason why. It's very selfish, but you're not interested in the world around you except how to control it because you're so afraid of living. And that's what Old Testament thinking is about, fear. New Testament believers think differently. They think, oh yes, we should have gun control. I get the idea. We don't want anyone to have a gun. We want people who are responsible, who are going to respect other people, who don't live in fear. We want people to have guns, perhaps in official capacity, like in police, but on a personal level, we don't need to live in that kind of fear. If you have a gun, then we should make sure that you know how to use that gun. You should have a test, much like we have road tests for our cars. Guns are very dangerous pieces of machinery, much like a car. If you don't know how to drive a car, you could kill people. If you don't know how to use your gun, you could end up killing people, and that you don't want to kill. And if you're doing it because you're so afraid of life, then you're not really living a good Christian life. Even though I know you call yourself a Christian. But that's the distinction. Gun control is more of a Christian value-based, New Testament kind of thinking. Anti-gun control is more of an Old Testament, social conservative Christian perspective. That's how you can distinguish. Your politics will betray your Christianity. You're not really a Christian if you're not living your life in a Christian value base in the here and now. If you're only focused on the afterlife and you're just trying to keep your head low because you live in fear of others and others who are not following the rules of God, then I feel sad for you. So if you really want to try to live in a different way, then you should make me your online pastor. You can subscribe, that would be very helpful. But I will be bringing you through all of this. This is not the only lecture or moment of preaching that I'm going to share. I'm going to share whatever wisdom I have as often as I can. And I would also eventually like to have a talk show where people can talk about their political viewpoints and their Christian perspectives. And I can reveal all of this for them. Just understanding that your politics dictates whether you think as a New Testament believer or an Old Testament believer, even though you might call yourself a Christian in both cases. Now, I understand that atheists who might have progressive thinking might kind of resent that I'm not really talking to you at the audience, but I am just acknowledging that progressives have more Christian-based New Testament thinking, whether they think of themselves as Christians or not. I'm just saying that Christians should align themselves with progressive ideas because they tend to be more Christian value-based New Testament thinking. than social conservative Christian thinking does. That's all Old Testament stuff. They're not interested in uplifting the world. They don't want to necessarily be part of the system that creates love in themselves or others and creates peace in themselves and others. They just say, hey, I'm following the rules. And if anyone doesn't follow the rules or they're trying to do something to control me, they should be punished. So that's the distinction. And you can apply it, like I said, to anything. I have a couple of more examples here. Immigration. If you're an anti-immigrant, you're an Old Testament fear-based Christian. You don't want anybody. New Testament thinkers, absolutely compassionate. We understand that the world is a harsh place and that we should probably open up our borders. Not completely, I don't mean just anybody, but we should have a better immigration policy where we can be more compassionate, where we can help people. We can act like Christians with real values of love and peace. Same with Medicare for all. If you're pro Medicare for all, you have a Christian perspective, even if you don't call yourself or you don't even call yourself a Christian. That perspective is rooted in non-judgment, forgiveness, love, and peace. These are all elements that draw you towards the idea of Medicare for all. That's Medicare for all is that you're compassionate. You want everyone to have access to medical care. There's nobody that should live without medical care because they're too poor. That's just not Christian. And for social conservative Christians to insist that there should not be a universal health care program at all, because why should we concern ourselves with the poor, reveals exactly the kind of Christian you are or are not. Because you're not living a Christian value-based life when you think like that. So you're rejecting Medicare for all out of fear. You're saying, if we have the government control so that everybody has access to health care, well, then it's going to be too expensive for me. I'm going to have to pay more taxes. So you're afraid of paying more taxes. You're afraid that you won't have access to care because there's just going to be too many people. And I have to ask myself, well, why, as a Christian, would you even be concerned about those things? Because as a Christian, you should want everybody to be cared for because you have compassion. But your politics tells me you don't have compassion. Your politics tells me that the anti-universal care perspective is not about Christian values, it's about fear. You're afraid too much government control is going to take more money, and probably think that too much government control is going to lead to communism, which is going to lead to losing my religion, which I find ironic, because you're not even living the religious life you should be living if you call yourself a Christian. You're locked into Old Testament fear-based, condemnation-based, punishment-based thinking. And Christ wanted better for you and for the world, and you should have embraced that. That's why I should be your online pastor, because you need to use your real Christian values so that you can gain perspective, better perspective on your political action and life as you should be living it in the here and now. You can live a far better, less fearful life if you choose to embrace Christian value-based values of non-judgment, forgiveness, love, and peace. That is the core of your best spiritual life here on earth. I get it. You want to make sure you got your ticket to ride in the afterlife, but you can do so much more with your whole Christian perspective if you really even love being a Christian. If you could embrace the real Christian values and incorporate them in your life and in your thinking every day, your politics would change. It absolutely will change. Climate change is another example. You're living a life of fear. You don't want government control for the same reason. You don't want to pay more taxes. You don't want to have them control, because eventually that means communism, that means they're going to take away their religion. But a pro-lifer, a New Testament-minded Christian who has those basic values, understands that we have to do something because we love our creation. We love our earth. We know we have proper dominion and we have responsibility to make sure our earth is cared for. And if it takes more money, if it takes more hard work to make sure we live in a safe, clean environment, we should do that. But not Old Testament Christian thinkers. They don't think like that. They don't have the broad pro-life vision of fighting climate change, of the need to step up, stop pollution, stop having fossil fuels as the source of our economy. As wretched as that might seem, because it's going to be too poor, you're making it all about you because you're too afraid. If you were a real Christian with Christian values, you would have the vision. You would be able to change your politics and be an advocate for making climate change a reality, and making it so that we do not keep destroying our earth, destroying God's creation. But you can't see it now because you're living in fear. You're living in the condemnation, punishment world of the Old Testament. You can do better than that. And any political issue, even beyond this, can be applied in the same way every single time. We can definitely recognize social conservative Christian thinking, a tie to Old Testament thinking versus New Testament Christian value-based thinking. They are totally different. Progressive-minded is more of a Christian value-based perspective, whether you're a believer or not. So progressives don't think of it as an insult because Christians should align with you. They should align. You have it right. You don't have to believe in Christ or the values of Christ, but you can argue that this is more of a Christian perspective than the social conservative perspective that social conservative Christians cling to, because they think that's in line with God's law. And that's the oppression. God's law is the oppression. Christ's vision is the salvation. If you can't see the distinction between the two, then there isn't much I can do for you. But I'll gladly be your pastor. And if you would, come share with me, subscribe, and I will help you understand the difference between Christian value-based living and Old Testament social conservative living. They are powerfully different, and you can change your life. And you can change the world. So come along with me. Thank you for listening. Take care.